So in 1884, James McNeill Whistler was already well known as a painter, who was also a groundbreaking etcher, who additionally worked in pastel and dabbled in dry point and lithography. But in 1884, he added yet another feather to his cap with a one-man exhibition featuring an extensive body of watercolors. Right out of the box, Whistler adopted a daringly innovative approach, his mature style seemingly developed overnight. On analysis, however, we can see that his work in other media over the past 2 decades had laid the groundwork for Whistler's very remarkable watercolors. Whistler's early work in the medium was striking but quite conventional, made in the tradition of tinted drawings that served as models for engraving. After an initial sketch in pencil, which would have looked something like this, he used watercolor to define areas of relative light and shade. The tinted drawing then provided the model for an etching, which was the real focus of Whistler's attention. In 1859, Whistler began to experiment with dry point, a type of intaglio engraving that produces fine lines edged by a subtle velvety burr. Whistler's exploration of this technique reflects his gravitation toward a softer, more simplified treatment of form, as in this ethereal image. Whistler focused his attention here on his model's delicate features, her shimmering hair, and her tightly encased bodice, while allowing the rest of her body to dissolve into an insubstantial, wispy lines. And this is an effect that he would later pursue in his watercolors. Shifting his focus from works on paper to oil paintings, Whistler in the late 1860s began several ambitious experimental paintings that never advanced beyond freely handled oil sketches such as this. Rather than destroy or paint over such works, as he so often did with other pieces, Whistler proudly displayed these sketches in his dining room. Their somewhat mysterious, unresolved quality clearly appealed to him, and their appearance of fresh spontaneity was a perennial source of inspiration for his later work, and especially his watercolors. Also during the late 1860s, Whistler began to experiment with a highly diluted paint medium, thinned with turpentine to create a very liquid, runny sauce. And this thin medium behaved somewhat like watercolor, dissolving brushstrokes and softening contours. In The Artist in His Studio, a painting begun in 1865, the gray ground of the canvas shows through the sheer layers of paint. In the drapery of the 2 models, for example, we can see the gray ground, but visible brush strokes work with that to create and articulate the folds and swags of the fabric. Whistler's minimalist, almost abstract treatment of form in this sketch anticipates the approach he later adopted in his watercolors. The radical reduction of detail stimulates our visual imagination to complete the picture. To intuit, for example, the missing handle from this floating Japanese fan, and the complex position of the artist's wrist and fingers, and his virtually transparent legs, all articulated with a bare minimum of brushstrokes. And this minimalist aesthetic that we really begin to see here, along with the subject of the models lounging informally in this rarefied atmosphere of the artist's studio, really trading on Whistler's cachet as this remarkable kind of genius in his very carefully orchestrated studio environment. All of these things would later become predominant themes in Whistler's watercolors. At this date, however, watercolor was barely on Whistler's radar. Among the few watercolors he produced in the 1860s, this sketch, which is related to The Artist in His Studio, indicates a surprising lack of interest in exploring the full potential of the medium. He's working with a very opaque gouache that has this dry, chalky, sort of fresco-like appearance, entirely lacking watercolor's distinctive transparency. And there you see another view. Whistler continued his experiments with highly diluted oil paint into the 1870s with his nocturnes. He created abstract nighttime riverscapes such as this by brushing a thin oil medium across the canvas in bold, sweeping strokes. The diffuse washes of blue and black pigment seep into the canvas and bleed into one another in a manner similar to watercolor, creating subtle shifts in tone that suggest rather than define form. Whistler also pursued the soft, washy appearance of watercolor through his experimentation with a form of lithography known as lithotint, in which images are created with a greasy ink wash rather than the standard solid lithographic crayon. Whereas a traditional lithograph resembles a drawing, lithotints resemble watercolor, exhibiting the soft atmospheric effects that you see here and here in this delicate diaphanous figure and the wonderful watery effects in the background, especially on the right side. Whistler produced these lithotints in 1878, the fateful year of his libel case against the influential art critic John Ruskin. Like many others, Ruskin objected to what he saw as a lack of finish in Whistler's paintings, claiming that rather than invest the time and labor necessary to bring his work to completion, Whistler merely flung a pot of paint in the public's face. Whistler won the libel case, but the court costs, combined with his abortive painting projects of the past 10 years, and his dispute with his patron Frederick Leyland over payment for the Peacock Room, resulted in bankruptcy. Bowed but not broken, Whistler left London for Venice, where he produced an extensive series of etchings that further explored the pared-down aesthetic, and Ruskin would have said the incompleteness, that Whistler had been cultivating in a variety of media. In etchings such as this panoramic view of a Venetian canal, Whistler concentrated detail near the horizon line, leaving large areas of the etching plate virtually untouched above and below. In those unetched areas of the plate, he wiped ink in such a way that when printed, yielded soft gradations of tone suggestive of the atmosphere of a darkening sky and reflective water. And then in this later state of the same etching, it shows how Whistler approximated the effect of watercolor wash by wiping brown ink on the etching plate to create a more dramatic aura of sort of radiating out from the horizon. Occasionally, Whistler brushed ink wash directly on a print to test out ideas for toning future etched impressions. Here, he's used a brown wash to darken portions of the water and the arched doorway. And here's another impression, this one printed with plate tone, creating the wash effect. In light of these efforts to add wash effects to his etchings, it's not surprising that Whistler began to dabble in watercolor itself in Venice. This view of a canal resembles the panoramic scenes represented in many of his etchings, but it gains much from the addition of color. And you can see how the exposed areas of white paper support that are untouched by the blue and gray pigment create this impression of clouds and shimmering light on the water. Also while in Venice, Whistler made this watercolor of his mistress and frequent model, Maud Franklin, reclining in a hammock. Whistler's radical simplification of form here verges on abstraction, compelling the viewer's imaginative eye to merge the somewhat disconnected shapes, patterns, and colors. The purity and simplicity of watercolor made it a fitting medium for Whistler's pursuit of radical simplification. This particular watercolor was made for a friend rather than exhibition or sale, which certainly accounts for some of its informality, yet it seems significant that Whistler chose to preserve serendipitous effects, such as the bloom created by an errant droplet of water beneath the hammock, and the unblended dabs of brown that define Maud Franklin's profile, marks that others might consider accidents or blemishes, but that convey an intimate, impromptu quality that Whistler valued. His approach to watercolor had come a long way from the similar subject that I showed you earlier, in which opaque gouache created a chalky appearance, entirely lacking the fresh, fluid transparency of the later work. After returning to London in November 1880, Whistler sought to shore up his shaky finances by mounting 3 exhibitions of his Venetian etchings and pastels. He then spent several months rapidly producing enough additional work to fill a 4th exhibition, held in 1884 at Dowdeswell's Gallery in London, entitled Notes, Harmonies, Nocturnes. Along with small paintings and pastels, the exhibition featured the first extensive group of watercolors Whistler had ever exhibited. In anticipation of the usual complaints about lack of finish, Whistler staged a preemptive strike by prefacing the exhibition catalog with a set of assertions concerning the relationship of labor to finish in a work of art. Statements such as, a picture oops, sorry, we can go back. A picture is finished when all trace of the means used to bring about the end has disappeared. To say of a picture that it shows great and earnest labor is to say that it is incomplete and unfit for view. Work alone will efface the footsteps of work. The work of the master suggests no effort and is finished from the beginning. These statements turned complaints about lack of finish on their head by arguing that visible signs of labor were actually defects, not strengths, because they interfered with the pleasurable impression of beauty created with spontaneity and ease. Whistler failed to convince everyone, but many critics praised his watercolors. Several admired their achievement of subtle atmospheric effects, such as, sorry, I'm not getting this to go forward. I'm having a technical difficulty. I'm not sure what happened. Should I try maybe this?
Try that, yeah. Is that working?
No, where do I aim it?
I think it's the right left button. Which side are you on?
Just, let's see if I can get it to go there. Ah, here it is, okay, thank you. In any case, they were praising these atmospheric effects, such as you see here, this vaporous stillness of an Amsterdam canal and the smoky atmosphere of Piccadilly. These examples highlight Whistler's skill in working wet into wet, that is, applying wet pigments to saturated paper in order to create a diffuse bleed effect, ideal for representing atmospheric conditions. Where more precision was required, Whistler manipulated his medium with great control. For example, preserving rectangular spaces for the windows, which he filled with warm brown pigment suggestive of glowing light. In addition to creating luminous nocturnes, Whistler exploited the special properties of watercolor to depict sparkling daylight scenes. In Pink Note, Shelling Peas, the central figure, rendered in cool pinks and grays, appears almost translucent from a distance, in contrast with the warm, earthy browns that frame her. And flashes of exposed white paper enhance the impression of shimmering light. This image also highlights the deliberate flatness that Whistler had been cultivating in his art since the late 1860s, largely out of admiration for Japanese prints. In his watercolors of the previous decade, such as The Kitchen, which I showed you before, Whistler created a dramatic sense of spatial recession through the converging diagonal lines of the composition. In later works, such as Pink Note, by contrast, he deliberately collapsed spatial depth by treating the planes as flat, rectilinear shapes and patterns. The diagonal line of the trellis overhead provides the merest hint of spatial recession. In another daylight scene, Violet and Amber, Whistler used the wet into wet technique to create the impression of a blinding flood of light pouring in from the window and across the floor, dissolving form and flattening space. Many of Whistler's watercolors evoke the behind-the-scenes ambiance of the artist's studio, recalling the mid-1860s oil sketch and gouache study that you saw earlier. Here, for example, we see two women absorbed in a private tete-a-tete over cups of tea, with the ghostly forms of stretched canvases at right and swags of fabric at left, identifying the space as a working studio. The unfinished appearance of the drawing creates an impression of speed and ephemerality, as if we are catching a glimpse of a fleeting moment that will soon end, perhaps when the women see the artist's presence and break off their intimate chat. Whistler retained the impression of a rapidly dashed off sketch by heavily working some areas and rendering others in less detail. Considerable effort went into creating the pleated skirt of the woman seated at left, for example. Whistler superimposed layer upon layer of pale pink, lavender, and gray of various degrees of transparency and opacity. And you can see in this oil painting about the same period in which Whistler represented a similar skirt, he really couldn't match the wonderful filmy, floating, diaphanous impression you get from the watercolor. In contrast to the heavily worked figure on the left, the companion figure on the right is almost entirely abstracted, merely blocked in with thin washes of flesh color, gray, and brown. Her gesture is difficult to read, and her face is entirely undefined. Whistler often glossed over women's facial features in order to redirect the viewer's attention to the overall arrangement of color and form, in which the female figure was intended just as one decorative element. In this picture, as in other watercolors, Whistler used a smudge of pale zinc white encrusted pigment to actually blot out the detailed facial features of the woman on the left, so that they become nearly as vague as her companions. In this way, Whistler left more to the viewer's imagination. A few critics complained that they could not get a good look at the women in Whistler's 1884 exhibition, either because the artist had literally effaced them or because the drawings dissolved into a chaos of brushstrokes at close range. And I think the critic's fixation on the faces of Whistler's young women bears out his wisdom in taking them out of the equation, lest they steal attention from the composition as a whole. Whistler's watercolor Millie Finch again evokes the behind-the-scenes appeal of the artist's studio. Thanks to note in pink and purple, we can recognize the vaguely sketched forms in the background as stacked canvases and swags of fabric, though Whistler now treats them as purely abstract compositional elements. And he draws an even more pronounced distinction between the heavily worked figure on the left, whose dress is rendered in numerous layers of watercolor washes, with the radically simplified figure on the right. The figure remains an abstract armature of line and color that communicates an impression of a body without mimetically reproducing it. It's doubtful that Whistler would have left this figure in such an undetermined state had the watercolor been intended for public exhibition or sale, instead of for another artist, Walter Sickert, to whom Whistler gave it in 1884. Despite the repeated complaints about Whistler's lack of finish, he was clearly sensitive to the differing degrees of resolution appropriate for public exhibition in comparison with private consumption by a colleague who understood his aims and methods. I'd like to conclude with this depiction of Maud Franklin, shown ascending a staircase in Whistler's studio. It synthesizes several aspects of Whistler's work in watercolor: his apparent spontaneity in capturing fleeting moments, the uneven degree of finish that enhances the impression of transience, and the element of serendipity and unpredictability inherent in the watercolor medium itself. All of these characteristics fed into Whistler's ideal of artistic mastery and his public image as a showy performer. As he stated at the Ruskin trial, the speed with which he worked reflected superior expertise, the knowledge of a lifetime, as he called it. And so evidence of speed, rather than evidence of labor, was the quality he cultivated. This impromptu glimpse of studio life was not made for exhibition or sale. It was Whistler's gift to Maud Franklin. So here again, in a work intended as a private, personal gift, we can discern the footsteps of work that Whistler labored so hard to efface from his publicly exhibited pieces. Evidence of indecision and second thoughts are evident in the profile of Maud's hat and the position of her arm, above both of which we can clearly see the ghostly presence of other earlier hats and arms. These marks have the unintended consequence of suggesting a figure in motion, not just Maud's, but also Whistler's, as he labored with his brushes on the paper. Many more traces of Whistler's labor will be revealed through the exhibition here at the Freer, and also through all the technical evidence that has been gathered in connection with it. And I have to say that as much as I admire Whistler, the dazzling showman, I'm very much looking forward to becoming better acquainted with Whistler, the earnest worker. Thank you.